Hi, folks. Lots of people coming in to the session this morning. We're going to give them just about a minute or so before we get underway, and then we'll introduce the team and get into the presentation. For those folks just joining, we're just going to wait about 30 seconds. We've got a lot of people just coming into the call here. We'll probably wait 30 seconds before we start. Okay, we're going to get underway. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the Botanix Pharmaceuticals Investor webinar. My name is Matt Callahan. I'm one of the founders and a board director of Botanix. We're going to be joined on the call here by Botanix's Executive Chairman, Vince Ippolito, our CEO, Howie McKibben, as well as a number of our newly expanded commercial team members, including our Chief Business Officer, Boris Meissen, our Head of Corporate Affairs, David Morgan, and our VP of Managed Markets, John Scholl, along with a Chief Medical Advisor, Patricia Walker, and also a special guest, the Executive Director of the International Hyperhidrosis Society, Lisa Peretti, who's kindly joined us this morning. So we have a deck that we're going to run through. We're going to try and keep the timing to around about an hour, plus some questions. There is a function down the bottom of the Zoom there where you can ask questions. They'll come through to us, and we'll spend some time at the end of the session addressing as many of those questions as we can. So with that, thank you. And Vince, please take us away. Howie, I think you're
joining us here today. So thank you for taking the time today to be with us here. Next slide, please. We'll be making some forward-looking statements here in our presentations. Please read our full disclosure that's available online for that. With so many people joining this teleconference here today, some of you are very familiar with the story, but some of you are new to us as well. Well, Botanix is a dermatology-focused company that solely focuses on common skin diseases in dermatology. One of those common skin diseases is the mainstay of our product portfolio, and that is in the area of hyperhidrosis, which is excessive sweating. The expertise in the company is really to deliver topical medications to these common skin diseases. It's where our expertise lies today in delivering topical medications, most certainly considered safe and effective, not only by patients, by physicians too, in treating these diseases. One of the really unique things about Botanix is its world-class team. This team has worked together for so many years, some greater than 20 years together, but what is second to none as a dermatology company here, this team has launched more than 30 drugs in the commercial space. And when I mean launched, I mean we've taken these drugs all the way from their new chemical entity states or their development states and brought them all the way through the product lifestyle to commercialization. The flagship here at Botanix of our product portfolio is Sofdra, and that is for the treatment of axillary hyperhidrosis. And when approved, it will be the first and only new chemical entity for the treatment of primary axillary hyperhidrosis here in the United States. Now, we're targeting approval here in June of 2024, which is right around the corner. Everything else prior to that, the submittal of the component required for approval, that was the instructions for use has already been completed here in the first quarter of 2024. Next slide, please. So as a corporate overview, currently our market capitalization is at $430 million. That's Australian dollars here. Last reported cash was $17.3 million. No debt within the company. Major shareholders, Arteris Capital at 9%. The board and management team is holding approximately 7%. And the top 20 shareholders, about 1/3 of the outstanding shares here. The last 3 months have been very favorable here to Botanix. Many thanks to our loyal and new shareholders, as we've seen significant growth in the stock as we're approaching our PDUFA date here in June. As we approach our commercialization stages, I wanted to point out our offices are in Perth, Australia. That's the corporate office there, but our commercial offices are located in Phoenix, Arizona, where we're presently broadcasting this commercial overview today from. And then our development offices in the United States are in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. Matt had introduced all the speakers here today, so we're very excited that you're going to be hearing from the vast majority of the people on this slide. And as I had mentioned, the relationships professionally here go back some more than 20 years. So this team is very used to working together and executing on not only development strategies, but more importantly, commercial strategies, which we're going to share with you today. Next slide. When we take a look at all of the various drugs that this team has launched, this could look like to you on the screen as a collection of baseball cards. But for us, it really represents some of the leading products in dermatology and outside of the space. Drugs that varied from $200 million in sales up way above $1 billion in sales. And many of these drugs we managed all at the same time. Some of them became the leaders within their categories, not only in the US, but globally. So those of you familiar with dermatology, you can see it's a very impressive list of assets that are sitting here today, in which Sofdra will soon become one of the great success stories here as well. Next slide. Well, as Matt had mentioned, we have a very special guest here that's joining us here today, Lisa Peretti, Executive Director and one of the founding members of the International Hyperhidrosis Society. And she's going to talk about the patients to you. And, you know, as I showed you that last slide of all the drugs that this team has launched, it really starts with thinking about the patient in the beginning. So before we ever develop a drug, we think about the patient. We think about the burden of their disease, the options that are available to them, and access to those options as well. So that's where we start. And where we really end is what this conference is really about today, is as we approach commercialization, we bring ourselves back to the patient, because what you'll see today is a very patient-centered focus on how we're going to commercialize our asset, that is Sofdra. So without any further ado, Lisa, welcome. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I am pleased to be here, and I am honored and humbled to be representing the millions of people who suffer with hyperhidrosis. I started the International Hyperhidrosis Society in 2003, along with a team of dermatologists and leading researchers in the field of hyperhidrosis. It is designed to be a hub of collaboration. And as you can see here, Botanix is showing up as one of the most collaborative innovators that I've ever encountered. What we do at the International Hyperhidrosis Society is set on 4 pillars. The first is awareness, and I'm talking about public awareness, so that those with hyperhidrosis will live in a kinder world and not feel as bullied. If we can raise the awareness in the public that hyperhidrosis is a medical condition, that someone who is sweating excessively is doing so because of a genetic issue, then perhaps the bullying will dissipate. We also do patient and disease impact research, as well as diagnostic research, and set out guidelines for healthcare providers to use in both diagnosing and in treating hyperhidrosis. We are the only ones in the world who put forth accredited education for healthcare providers. And last but certainly not least, every day we are advocating for patients on a one-on-one basis. So we are working with them to get them through their insurance issues, or writing letters to the college counselors to give them extra time on their SATs because they need to dry off. Our work is all about connecting stakeholders to reduce or eliminate the barriers to safe and effective care, and center this innovation on what truly meets what patients want in their treatments and in their life. I think it's important to know that hyperhidrosis starts in childhood and adolescence. And at that time, when it starts, this person has no other medical condition most of the time. And so helping them eliminate this influences the trajectory of their entire life. So this is a solvable problem, although it has not been solved yet. Next slide, please. This slide here is talking about the healthcare provider standpoint. So when asked, how comfortable are you in managing your patient's hyperhidrosis with the available treatments? As you can see, hyperhidrosis leads the pack on the feeling of being inadequate care at the present time for the doctors and the patient relationship. And this mirrors the patient experience. So oftentimes they will go to the doctors and be given treatments that are subpar. They have terrible side effects, and the patients often give up. So then they revert back to simply being sufferers and no longer are patients. So we are excited to have new treatment options come forth that are safe and effective and improve upon the current situation that we have now, which is not ideal and not enough. It's not enough what we have. And I'll give you a little a story. I can't count how many times when I'm at a conference in dermatology, I have healthcare providers coming up to me and saying, "What's new? What do you have for me?" Because I don't even want to see these hyperhidrosis patients in my office because I can't solve it. They want to solve the problem. And I believe personally that it is solvable. And I'm so glad to be here to help the cause. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Next slide, let's continue on here. The Sofdra overview.
Hello, I am Dr. Patricia Walker. So what's really interesting about Sofdra is its mechanism of action, right? It binds to the M3 AC receptor, so it's an anticholinergic, which when it binds to the receptor stops and inhibits sweating. So that's a common way or a way to treat hyperhidrosis. But what makes this product unique, and it's shown in the picture here, when the round, which is the drug, hits the bloodstream, it's quickly metabolized, and that's metabolized into an inactive, really greatly less active product, which then is eliminated quickly through the kidneys. By being inactive, you have way fewer side effects, such as dry mouth, dry eyes, and an inhibition to eliminate your urine. So all of those side effects are blocked down and greatly reduced with this product. So it acts on the M3 AC receptor, decreases sweat, and then is quickly metabolized. And it was designed that way as a soft drug through what's known as a retrometabolic metabolism. Next slide. The FDA approval endpoints are 2. So the company had to achieve success in both the patient-reported outcome, which is known as the HD SM axillary, as well as the gravimetric sweat production, or the GSP. And this is a really high hurdle because they had to win on 2 different endpoints with a very high degree of success for both of them. What is the HDSM-AX? That's a validated endpoint that was developed specifically for hyperhidrosis. It asks 7 questions which are important to the hyperhidrosis sufferer. So these are the kinds of things that Lisa was referring to that are important to the patient. So it's 7 questions. There is a child's version, and that child version is really only slightly different in the way those questions are asked. The other endpoint is an objective endpoint. So it's the gravimetric sweat production. That is a measurement to measure the amount of sweat a person has over 5 minutes. And that's a pretty straightforward procedure done in the doctor's office after the patient has equilibrated to the office to the temperature for 30 minutes or so. So again, a subjective endpoint, the HDSM axillary, on how you feel about your sweating, and then the objective endpoint, which is the gravimetric sweat. Next slide. This slide really gives me great pleasure to present to you because if you just look at the p-values, they were highly significant. And in our review of the NDA data, the FDA had no questions or information requests on the efficacy or safety of the product. So briefly, if you look at the left side of your screen, you see the measurements for the HDSM axillary. This was a 2-point change, which the FDA required, although it's worth noting that the 1-point change was clinically meaningful to patients. So again, we have a p-value there of 0.0001 with close to 60% of the patients achieving that success. It was notably over the high 80s, almost 90% of the patients did achieve the 1-grade change. Now, if you look on the right side of your screen, that's the objective endpoint of gravimetric sweat production. And you can see that this is also highly statistically significant. And in the Sofdra treated patients, they had 138.1 milligram reduction of their sweat in that 5-minute time point. And that's very impressive relative to other products on the market. And I think that's my last slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Patty. We want to go over, I'm just going to take us through kind of where we are from a regulatory perspective and also make a couple of comments in relation to manufacturing. Thanks for the next slide, Kate. So as folks know, we resubmitted the NDA for Sofdra back in December of last year. That was in response to some communication from FDA that we should update the patient instructions for use and to make a few changes in relation to the bottle label and how the carton is also designed to display prominently some information that FDA thought was important. So obviously, as part of that process, we had to conduct some human factors studies to test how naive participants interact with that information and then refile all that. And so the kind of the punchline here is FDA advised us back in January that what we had submitted constituted a complete response, which is a technical regulatory term, which is very pleasing. And so what we've been doing since then is obviously communicating with FDA in relation to those human factors activities that we conducted and clarifying questions that they have. And through communication with FDA in recent weeks, obviously very confident about the timing for the review of the NDA and the date that we've communicated to the market around approval for the end of June. So very pleasing progress and obviously very excited to get to the end of that process and have the product approved as well. Thank you. Next slide. Just want to talk, we've had a number of questions from investors around kind of how are we manufacturing this, and we've got some questions in the chat here as well about where do we manufacture it and how do we know that we can manufacture for the volumes that we're expecting and kind of where do things come from and where they're made. So for all the different components on the left-hand side, from the things that make up the bottle itself, the pump, the applicator, the cap on the applicator, the various excipients that go into making the gel, and the API or the drug all come together at our manufacturer in Canada, which is called CPL. CPL manufacture that drug for us, and as we'll discuss in a minute, it goes from Canada into the mainland US for distribution. So we've manufactured this at the commercial scale that we intend to sell at. So there's no risk associated with scaling up the process. And we have capacity at CPL to make a lot of the drug. The actual process for making the drug and putting it in bottles is only a few day process each time we make a batch. The packaging also occurs at CPL, and then ultimately it's put on a truck back into the US. So that process is pretty well understood. We've piloted it, obviously, and we've used the same scale that we used in our phase 3 for the supply of the drug that we intend in the commercial setting. Thanks, Kate. Next slide. So kind of the final piece on the logistics setup for us is the 3PL, or the third party logistics provider. So these providers of services are really important because it avoids us having to kind of manage that whole supply chain, to build warehouses, and the technology that's involved in maintaining supply and inventory is really important because it ties in on the other end to our alternative fulfillment and pharmacy relationships as well. So this group, Eversana, is going to work with us to track all of the POs through the supply of product to the pharmacy and pharmacy outlets themselves, and then to manage issues that are associated with that through the usual call center approach. So all of this, again, has been in place for a couple of months. We've been testing these systems to make sure that they're ready to go, and the plan is to be ready with product very shortly after approval of the NDA plan for the end of June, as Vince mentioned. So I'm going to stop there and then hand back to Howie.
Thanks, Matt. And as you can imagine, right now we are aggressively gearing up for the launch of Sofdra in anticipation of our PDUFA date, the end of June. And we'd like to share some of our plans along with the new team. Next slide, please. Before we get to that, many of you have seen this before, but for those who haven't, hyperhidrosis is a pretty large market. 16 million Americans are suffering from this disease, and of those 16 million, 10 million have primary axillary hyperhidrosis, which is underarm hyperhidrosis. When we think about that as a market opportunity, that puts us in the top 3 with regard to dermatological conditions. What's interesting, there's about 3.7 million patients that have visited the doctor's office last year and been diagnosed with hyperhidrosis, leaving a balance of about 6.3 million. And we're going to speak to you in the coming slides with regard to how we're going to reach each of those populations. But suffice it to say, there's a bolus of patients available. They need an alternative, and Lisa clearly articulated that what's out there right now is not enough. Next slide, please. So we've talked to physicians, patients, and managed care about Sofdra and about the unmet need in the treatment of hyperhidrosis. Dermatologists told us that out of a scale of 1 to 7, the unmet need for treatment options was a 6. That indicates to us that they do want something new. And with regard to patients, they said something similar to that. And managed care put it 4 out of 7. In our experience, that tells us that they're going to cover. We rarely see them go outside the range of 3 to 5, so that puts us in a pretty good spot. Next slide. When you think of what's available, and what Lisa alluded to earlier, for the treatment of hyperhidrosis, you can see that there are many options. These patients are asked to start with an over-the-counter antiperspirant, and then moved to a clinical strength antiperspirant. After that, their options are prescription aluminum chloride. The problem with aluminum chloride is, number one, the FDA mandates that you can only have 20% concentration. It's enough to burn. It's not enough to give the efficacy that these patients desire. And you also bump that up against the fact that what it does is it clogs the pores. So it's uncomfortable. Clogs the pores, that you get lumps underneath the arms. And as an aside, this particular compound is also used to cauterize wounds, so there's a high amount of staining and burning. Then we also see reformulations, whether it's liquid, topical, or orals, of anticholinergics that were developed for other purposes. And the real issue there is the trade-off between all of the side effects that they encounter, whether it's dry mouth, blurry vision, urinary retention, constipation, that trade-off between dealing with those side effects or sweating. And they cope in various manners. Then they move on to more invasive procedures like Botox, mirror dry, and ultimately cutting of the nerves. So let's go to the next slide. So we did our own market research, of course, where we showed, first we asked physicians how they currently treat their patients with hyperhidrosis. And you can see on the left-hand side, for first-line treatment, they go to topical antiperspirants, some Qbrexza, some orals, and a little bit of Botox. We showed them the target product profile or the description of Sofdra and asked them what they would do if they had Sofdra as an option in their armamentarium. And they told us that first line, when the patient walked in, they would use it 42% of the time. It was very positive. With regard to the second line treatment, meaning they tried something else before, where would they position Sofdra? In 50% of the patients. And you can see they're taking away from those top antiperspirants, which they've likely tried and failed, Qbrexza, some of the orals, and Botox. So what we have here in summary is very large market, an unmet need as defined by all three key stakeholders, and a product that's viewed very positively by the physician base. So let's move on to the plan itself. So with regard to the launch strategy, we want to rapidly establish Sofdra as safe and effective first-line treatment for primary axillary hyperhidrosis. And our main focus, as we said earlier, is on the patient. We want to engage and motivate these patients to take control of their hyperhidrosis and see a telemedicine physician for immediate fulfillment. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Then I'll turn it over to John Scholl, our new Vice President of Managed Care, who's been in the industry over 35 years, specifically in this area, to provide you an update. And then Dr. Boris Meyerson, our new Chief Business Officer, will discuss both telemedicine and providing frictionless access to the product or to Sofdra for our patients. And then I'll come back and speak to how we're going to educate our physicians and build our sales force. So next slide, please. So transitioning over from this slide to engaging and motivating patients, we'll talk about some of the targeting metrics that we use to find them and efficiently motivate them to seek treatment. Next slide, please. So we have a number of tools available to us to plan, activate patients, and then evaluate the success from segmentation to targeting and metrics. We have the ability now to connect both health information and non-health data to gain a holistic view of the patient. So what do I mean by that? Crossix actually identifies those patients who've been diagnosed with hyperhidrosis and matches them through other data sets to characteristics that are non-health, ultimately painting a portrait of the exact type of patient who not only has hyperhidrosis, but who is likely to click on a specific ad and then engage in the process of getting a diagnosis through telemedicine and fulfillment through mail order. And we're able to utilize these data not only to be efficient, but to consistently measure. Let's go to the next slide. So from there, these data allow us a centric approach to activate the patients and prioritize which patients are most valuable, where they're going to consume information, and how they leave one channel and enter the other. And the beauty of this is that we are then able to identify both their URL of their home, their URL of their phone, and have a good understanding of when and where they're looking to consume information about the disease state itself, and when they're most likely to act. We call that the teachable moment, or the moment of relevance. And that is most important, because we're looking at a focused campaign that allows us to get not only the most bang for your buck, but to ensure that our acquisition of that patient is as efficient as possible, and that we're able to continue on throughout that patient's life cycle to ensure they're adherent, they're compliant, and they get all the refunds. Next slide, please. We talk about AI targeting. AI targeting tells us more about audiences who care about hyperhidrosis, how to find them, and what they're saying to each other. So it's important now that we're not only segmenting the patients, identifying the patients, but we're speaking to them in a way that they understand and they want to be communicated to. And the appropriate nomenclature, the appropriate verbiage, with the appropriate imagery. And we can listen to them via AI. We understand the imagery that is most beneficial to moving them. We know who they are, where they are, and how to communicate with them. And this happens in real time, so we're constantly improving. Next slide, please. So ultimately, we're honing in on these actual patients during the moments of sharing sweat stories with AI social sentiment targeting. So for example, they're posting social hashtags, they're posting images and videos. And then from there, we're actually using audio recognition through these videos, not only to follow those particular influencers, but to partner with them so that they can influence other hyperhidrosis patients to be able to have exposure to the Sofdra experience. So in closing here, there's an inordinate amount of data at our fingertips that changes the way that we're communicating with these audiences. Where in the past, we would spend millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars on television trying to drive them in to go speak to a physician. Here, we're able to communicate to them at the time they want to be communicated to with the appropriate content so that they can see a telemedicine provider and ultimately get the product within 48 hours. And we'll speak later about how that changes what used to be a 2 to 6 month time period to 2 to 4 days. Next slide, please. John, take us through reimbursement and coverage.
Hello, everybody. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about reimbursement and coverage for Sofdra. So here in the United States, insurance reimbursement is critical to the success of any new product launch. And in the United States, in 2022, about 92% of the population, or 300 million people, had health insurance. Broken out between private insurance, which is about 2/3 of the insured covered patients, and about 36% was government, which is Medicaid, Medicare, and some of the VA patients. In the United States, the health insurance comes with a medical benefit that largely will cover medical treatments, procedures, office visits, and so forth, and a pharmacy benefit. The pharmacy benefit is going to cover all or part of the cost of a prescription product like Sofdra. And what we made the decision to do, Botanix, was to engage the payers well before approval. And we did this because we have had past experience as we introduced new products to the marketplace. And we found that the payers generally would respond very well to this. So what we've determined and been able to find out over the past 6 to 8 weeks is that Sofdra, because it is a self-administered drug, will be covered under the pharmacy benefit of the patients and will not require a code for coverage. We also have been able to establish that hyperhidrosis is a recognized medical condition with existing coverage policies that have been put in place by many of the largest health insurance payers. And we have begun to engage in discussions with the payers to provide the patients with that frictionless access that we've been talking about, not only on the first fill of Sofdra, but every refill going forward. Next slide, please. So this graph shows a little bit about how the Sofdra reimbursement process is going to work. And as I explained earlier, patients will pay a portion of their insurance premium to their employer. The insurance premium is then paid from the employer to the managed care organizations, and that's used then to cover part of the pharmacy benefit that the patients are receiving. When Sofdra is prescribed, the patient will bring the prescription to the pharmacy for fulfillment, and the patients will pay $0 for a covered prescription, and a nominal amount if the product is not covered. The pharmacy will receive a reimbursement dollar amount from the managed care organization for Sofdra, and they will pass that reimbursement on to Botanix along with the patient's copay, minus a customary dispensing fee. Botanix in return will also pay a rebate back to the managed care organization for the coverage that we are able to achieve. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, we have taken a very aggressive early engagement approach with contacting these key payer accounts. So you can see here, the accounts are listed as 2 different types of accounts. Phase 1 accounts are the critical accounts that we need to engage with quickly before PDUFA, because these are the accounts that drive about 100 million of the lives. I'm happy to report that Viking Health, who is our third-party team, very experienced account management team, has already established calls and has completed calls with all of the phase 1 accounts. Each of the phase 1 accounts has already seen a clinical presentation on Sofdra, and the feedback has been extremely positive. Very good response from them in terms of the clinical results. Very open to the idea of a new product coming into the hyperhidrosis market, as Howie had alluded to, that they feel that there is a unmet need in terms of what products are currently available to treat hyperhidrosis. And the Viking Health team will now begin to transition and begin to call on the phase 2 accounts here in June. So we're super excited about the response from the payers so far for Sofdra, and looking forward to continuing to have some great success stories in the near future. Next slide, please.
Thank you, John. As my colleagues previously said, we are a patient-centric company. These patients have enough burden from the disease. They don't need additional friction from trying to navigate traditional channels in United States healthcare. That is why we want to design a patient access channel that allows to connect with sufferers and remedy very quickly in a short period of time. Next slide, please. Telemedicine in the post-COVID world became a mainstream tool in pharma companies. You can see that companies both big and small in different disease states employ telemedicine. And we have experience in our team actually on how to use telemedicine and fulfillment channel. Next slide, please. As previously was said, digital breadcrumbs left by us on the internet will lead patients to a landing site. Patients will fulfill a questionnaire, pay for a telehealth visit. If appropriate, the patient will get a prescription which will be electronically sent to our central pharmacy. That pharmacy will run benefits check and will ship the product within 48 hours. Patient doesn't have to wait for a long time to see a dermatologist. Patient does it out of comfort of their own home, and the product comes by mail. We don't even have to go pick it up. Next slide, please. What you see on screen are fragments from our telehealth portable responsive site. The patient fills out a series of questions which are designed for two purposes, for safety and also to collect all the data necessary for possible rejection from managing care. All the prior use of other products that the patient tried and failed would be recorded as answers to these questions and could be used later. We're very excited about having this channel. We believe that we are ready to go. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Boris. And before we get to driving derm adoption with physicians, I'll just give a quick summary here. You know, what we were speaking to were the 6.3 million patients that are currently out in the US suffering and not seeing a physician. They may have seen one in the past, but at this point, they're using coping mechanisms, and we have the ability to get to them. We get to them very efficiently. And one of the things we just discussed today, in fact, with Lisa, was the 50,000 individuals that are in the Hyperhidrosis Foundation database, and giving them the opportunity immediately upon approval to go through this process and to get the product and to ensure that they have the opportunity to take advantage of the work that's been done so far. So there's this bolus of individuals that we feel we'll get to very quickly with the help of Lisa and her work. The other 3.7 million are in the physician office, and that's where I'll focus the conversation on now. So next slide, please. Everyone back? Great. So look, we developed a number of derm tactics. It's grounded around a compelling story. Patty spoke about it. There's co-primary endpoints that were highly statistically significant. So well exceeded the bar with regard to approval. She didn't speak to some of the key secondary endpoints, but I will say that the number one key secondary endpoint was a 1-point improvement on the scale that she discussed. And on that endpoint, 8.5 or almost 9 out of 10 patients had a clinically meaningful experience. And that's very important. So we're going to be able to tell a physician or our physicians that almost 9 out of your 10 patients are going to feel the difference. And that's what these doctors want. They want their patients to come in. They want them to be satisfied. And we're going to make an armamentarium of tools to be able to educate those, or we've made an armamentarium of tools to be able to educate those physicians on the story. Quick and clear visuals, optimistic tone, maybe a touch of humor at times, and we'll be sharing these throughout. But it's something that, you know, number one, physicians helped us create them. We've tested them, and we're pretty confident, very confident, that they tell the story of the clean safety profile that we believe we'll have in the label, that we've seen in the data. Highly statistical significance for both co-primaries and all key secondaries, and ultimately the effect that this product has had on any patient that's tried. So, next slide, please. And just a quick example of how we'll bring this to life digitally, and then we'll also ensure that, like we do with our patients, we will provide information to our physicians in the places that they're looking, and then be able to follow them around for that moment of relevance, whether it's on their iPhone, whether at a convention, while they're taking off and landing on an airplane, but at those time periods where they're most likely to consume and be ready to learn about Sofdra. So next slide, regarding the sales force itself. So before we get to the actual alignment here, I'll just go back and say that there's about 14,000 dermatologists in the United States. When you get down to it, there's about 10,000 that are in practice that are not in academia. About half of those, right, the vast majority of prescriptions for medical dermatology. And we'll be focused on 4,500. Next slide, please. And here's how we do it. And here's where they are. It's not a surprise. Many of them are in places of high population, but we identify doctors with the greatest potential for prescribing, bumped up against what the reimbursement looks like. And we expand that reach of our sales reps using media, PR, physician influencers, and key opinion leaders, whether they're presenting at the podium, whether they're conducting dinner programs, or a number of other tactics. And we're able to do this with 25 sales reps. And it's something that we've done in the past multiple times and rapidly scaling up. We've been conducting interviews consistently throughout so that we have multiple choices for each territory. We're picking the best one that fits within a performance-based organization. Next slide, please. So with regard to Kaken, as many of you know, this is our Japanese partner that launched Ecloc, which is 5% software bromide back in 2020 for primary axillary hyperhidrosis. We had the opportunity to meet with Kaken, their sales team, their marketing team, their senior leadership team, and they shared information with us that was very encouraging. There's about 350,000 units sold by Kaken in the last 12 months. And that's in a situation where the incidence and prevalence of hyperhidrosis is similar to that in the US, yet Japan has only 1/3 the size of the population in the US. So when we think of that, we think of 350,000 units, potentially times 3 as being a very, very, very successful. What's most interesting is that Kaken's been able to mobilize significant numbers of new patients, even in the 3rd year of launch. And when you think of the value of a new patient to Botanix, you have to be reminded that the typical topical in the United States has about 2 fills per patient, right? And that's largely because of the way that the drug's distributed. Necessity to have to go back to the pharmacy each month for some of the barriers. The system we're putting in place automatically refills the patient's prescription and mails it to them on day 26. So we have very, very big opportunity here to maximize what's the largest driver in any forecast. Next slide, please. So Matt, why don't you come up and summarize for us, and then maybe we could take some questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. So if you just go to the next slide, thank you, Kate. Just as an overview of kind of where we are. So as you can see on all the important elements that support success with a product being freshly launched into the market, the tick boxes indicate that we've pretty much done everything that we need to do. There's some things that we're waiting on, obviously, with final packaging and labeling, which depends on the final approval and the wording of our final label, which is obviously top of mind for us at the moment, and the deployment of the field force, which obviously won't happen until after the approval and once we have the product available in the pharmacy and ready to go out to patients. But basically, most other things are pretty much done, and we're really locking and loading now from a commercial perspective to get the product ready and into the market and into the hands of the patients that desperately need a new solution in light of Lisa's comments earlier in the meeting. So with that, I'm going to pause. We do have north of 450 people on the call here, and so we've got a bunch of questions that have been coming through that have been trying to collate. So we'll probably spend 15 minutes or so going through some of those questions and trying to get to everyone's questions. I'm going to start with a question from Paul for you, Patty, if you don't mind, which is about the scales and the comparability between the data that was generated by Qbrexza in their studies, which is the most recently approved product, and Sofdra in our phase 3 studies. And part of that question is kind of comparing efficacy levels and kind of apples and oranges potentially with the different ways that those studies are measured.
Great. So first, let me just back up just a second and say, why are there 2 endpoints, right? When we were starting the initial phase 2 studies for Sofdra, Dermira, which owned Qbrexza at the time, was starting phase 3. So the FDA came to both companies and said, the endpoints that had been used for past drugs, which the main drug was Botox at that time, that is not an acceptable endpoint. Both companies need to create new endpoints. So that's why they're different. So if you go back in history, and if you look at what they did in Japan, they all used an endpoint called HDSS that the FDA said was no longer acceptable. So Dermira developed one called a visual analog scale, and it's a 0 to 10 point scale, which is 11 points because you count 0. And the patient marks where on that continuum they had a problem. The FDA said to get approved, you need to make a 4-point change on that 11-point scale. For Sofdra, we developed the HDSM axillary according to all the guidance documents for developing a patient-reported outcome. We interviewed patients and said, what is important to patients? We found 2 things, the severity and the frequency of their sweating. That resulted in 7 questions, which were a 0 to 4-point scale, or 5 points, that all looked at how a patient, how often or how severe their sweating was. And it's worth noting that they were all considered equal in value, added up, and the end score came out to be somewhere between 0 and 4. But when we looked at each individual score, they were all statistically significant. So the collection of the 7 and each individual, and they specifically addressed the 7 most important aspects of hyperhidrosis versus Dermira's, which was a 4-point change on sort of a global visual analog scale. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Patty. I've got a question here for Mark, and maybe Lisa, if you could take this one, please, which is more about the importance of telehealth for this particular patient population and how that might be different from, say, some other dermatology conditions.
Sure. So with hyperhidrosis, because everyone sweats, if you will, if you have hyperhidrosis and you're sweating excessively, those who do not have hyperhidrosis just think that the person who is sweating excessively is doing so for the same reasons that they would sweat excessively, if this makes sense. So in other words, if you don't have hyperhidrosis, you sweat excessively when you're working out, when you're hot, when you're nervous, maybe when you're not telling the truth. That's when you sweat. So when they look at someone who's sweating excessively, they will immediately adopt a negative perspective of them. Because of this, and because, as I mentioned before, hyperhidrosis starts so early, the person who has the condition will internalize what's going on with them. And when they internalize things, that is, by definition, the beginning of shame. And when you have shame, you have stigma, and you also do not want to talk about it. You want to hide it. And because of that, you will not want to go into a doctor's office. You won't want to talk to a doctor, call and make an appointment. So telemedicine offers this confidential, private place to talk and to build trust and build relationship, where before there was a barrier to that. The other thing I'd like to mention with telemedicine that is extraordinary, in my view, is when you look at the social determinants of health. So with telemedicine, we are able to reach people all over the country who may or may not have a dermatologist within driving distance. So we can reach rural areas. and finally help those people who have hyperhidrosis, who really honestly had no option for a healthcare provider. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Lisa. That's great. A question here from Chris, which is focused on why insurers, don't push back on paying for new drugs. There's also another question here around not needing a code for Sofdra, but are there obstacles that the insurers or the payers can put in front of you, and kind of what do you do about those? So maybe John, do you want to address that one, please?
Yes. So referencing the codes, again, because it's a pharmacy benefit product, because it's a prescription product, there are no codes that will be needed, like you hear about J codes and so forth. That's been confirmed by our team. And as far as obstacles go, I mean, that's part of what the insurance companies try to do, is they try and put up obstacles. That's their job in some ways. But what we've heard so far from the payers is that there will be some obstacles, but there are probably two obstacles we're going to deal with. One is going to be that the physician is going to have to properly state the patient has hyperhidrosis, which is done simply through electronic medical records. It's not a very difficult process to do, but that would be one of the requirements that we're going to see from the payers or the insurance companies. The second one is going to be that there has been a confirmation that the patient has had a trial and failure on a product like dry salt, the chloride type product. Again, as how we alluded to, the vast majority of patients, by the time they come in to see a dermatologist, have tried a dry salt type product. So again, we don't think that those will be significant barriers to prevent a physician from being able to prescribe Sofdra.
Right. Thanks, John. A bunch of commercial questions here. I just want to get to some of them. So first of all, from Cameron, maybe Howie, if you can take this one, please, which is, you've mentioned the importance of refills a number of times, and the fact that these patients will get refills as part of the fulfillment. Can you just make some comments around maybe the importance of that in terms of the overall forecast for Sofdra?
Absolutely. Why don't we all go on video? We're gonna need everybody's help with this. It's the most important. It's the most important driver in any forecast. I mentioned earlier that topicals, you might get 2 fills per patient per year. It's amazing when you think about the fact that even those individuals that have an organ replacement neglect to take their organ rejection medications. You would think that if you waited that long on a list to get a new kidney, you wouldn't miss a dose, but it happens, and it's part of the issues with healthcare. We've set this up so that refills are automatic. Said another way, health plans allow for a refill to occur on day 26, right? We will mail that prescription on day 26, so the patient has it. For those patients who are absolutely adherent, even if they were late just 5 days a month, they would lose 2 prescriptions a year if you do the quick math. So it's very important. If you think of going from 2 fills per patient just to 6, I mean, you're tripling your forecast simply by ensuring that the patient takes the medication as prescribed. So we're going to shoot for 12, right? I mean, that's once that patient is approved, they're typically approved, John, for a year.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And from that sense, or in that sense, we're going to make sure that on the 26th of each month for that year, we're going to send that refill. We're taking the burden out of the patient's hands of going to the pharmacy, or maybe they show up to the pharmacy and the product isn't there for some reason. They have to come back and they lose more days, but they forget. It's just part of life. We just want to make sure that they have it. There's always enough of it on hand for them. And from our perspective, when you're forecasting triple or.
Right. Thanks, Howie.
I
So
want to take after tripling it. Right.
We've heard a bunch of questions around Japan, so maybe I'll kind of pose this next one, and I'm happy to kind of address this one as well, which really echoes what you're talking about. So Russell has asked a question here in relation to what's happening in Japan and kind of how that translates to the US potential experience. So I just want to recap a couple of data points there. So Howie mentioned that Kaken have sold 350,000 units in the last 12 months in Japan. What was interesting in our discussions in Tokyo with the Kaken folks was that a good proportion of those, almost 75% of those units were new patients. So they're now in almost their fourth year of launch, and they're still finding, north of 250, 260,000 new patients to sell the drug to, because the refill rate in Japan is even lower than the US rate that Howie just quoted before. So given obviously the population differences between Japan and the USA, if we can do anything like a couple of 100,000 units of our product at the pricing that we're targeting in a year, we're going to have a pretty good forecast. And that maybe follows on nicely, Howie. We're getting into the details, getting into the weeds here. So a number of questions, Paul and Tom particularly, have been focusing in on kind of the forecast and what we can expect. And I've got some back of the envelope math from one of them here, which I'll share with you just to react to, which is your chart where you had the 10 million hyperhidrosis sufferers. If we use conservative math, if we got 1% of that population, it would be 100,000 patients. I'm following so far. If they get 6 refills, and if you only get $500 a prescription, that's, I can do that math, $300 million in sales. Is that math correct?
That math sounds correct, man. It's that's what 6 refills. 6 fills gold. And
Excellent.
that's a single digit percentage of that 10 million.
Right, thank you. So we're going to have a question here from Lucas. Maybe Boris, if you want to take this one, which is you mentioned telehealth and reliance on telehealth pretty strongly. How did dermatologists feel about telehealth potentially taking patients out of their consultation and shipping the product directly to them?
Dermatologists actually do not mind their patients receiving telemedicine help elsewhere. The patient still stays with the dermatologist because interaction with the telehealth provider is incidental. And dermatologists are very accustomed to products being shipped to patients' homes. It's the new norm now, so they're very comfortable with that. And we spoke with them, they will be fine.
Right, thank you. A question here from Ash, which was focused on the shelf life of the product and also the manufacturing relationship with CPL. So maybe I'll take that one. So we mentioned in the presentation that CPL in Canada will be manufacturing the product for us. Between the folks you see here on the screen, they've manufactured close to 20 topical products for the various brands that we mentioned earlier that have been launched. I mentioned they're already at commercial scale, so that risk we think is pretty well covered. So question here next up for maybe Vince, if you want to take this, which is more focused on kind of your track record and some of the teams here. So you've set yourself a bit of a bar with selling Medicis for about 2.4 billion, I think, and Anacor for about 5.2. So you're probably not feeling any pressure here, but what do you think about that from a benchmark for what the company's trying to achieve?
Thank you for that question, whoever asked that one. Obviously, from my introduction, very proud of the team that we've assembled here. Their excellent track record of success. I think, Matt, in those numbers that you're providing here, what the good news in those numbers is that Medicis came first at 2.4, and then Anacor came later at the 5.2. So we've got the right trend. But interesting what sits underneath that as I think about who acquired those companies, and for the dollar amounts that they were acquired for, and what was the reason they acquired both of those companies. So at Medicis, we had a very nice portfolio of products here, but what was really attractive to Bausch & Lomb or Bausch Health, it was Valiant at that time, is the platform that we built at Medicis. So nice array of products, but it sat on a distribution network, a platform that made it very easy for patients to be able to get access to the drugs. So with that, Valiant became a serial acquirer of many dermatology companies and just piled everything on top of the platform that we built. As I think about Anacor, what was attractive in that asset and company purchases, that was a new chemical entity in an area of high unmet need, a patent protected product that they were looking to acquire from us. So as I step back and I think about what we're building here at Botanix, and relevant to the question that you're asking, it's really an and, Matt, that we're building what we believe is a very innovative platform that the team has great experience in the past in operating in those areas of commercial expertise. And the first product that we're putting on top of it is a product of very high unmet need, highly patent protected, that we believe will be a great success. So here at Botanix, it's going to give us great optionality, maybe to acquire additional assets and put it onto this product, or be able to strategically partner with some other organizations that may be very interested in those assets or the platform in the future. So future looks bright as we're creating great optionality for ourselves.
All right, and thanks for the mention at the end there on kind of the platform importance and the potential for other products. That answers a couple of questions we have coming through here. But maybe, Howie, if I can go back to you, William and a couple of other folks have asked questions around the focus on social media and digital, as opposed to traditional billboards and direct to consumer rather advertising that often happens in the US here on television. Maybe can you make some comments around why that approach as opposed to kind of the traditional approach, and what difference that makes?
Yeah, it's interesting. What we found, and Lisa is the expert for many years in this space. But these patients can be a bit of recluse, right? And that they're forced into that life because of the shame, because of the self-consciousness, and it actually gets to the point where it affects their daily decisions on what they're going to do. And they are very active on the internet. For those who don't have access to that plethora of data, the sources that I showed you earlier, just go on Reddit. In the United States, there's 40,000 hyperhidrosis sufferers in that community, speaking about the challenges they face. Some might be a little humorous about it, but that's only because what we find is they can commiserate with each other. But there's a lot of shame involved. We don't want to leave the house. They're looking for options. Yeah, and that really makes telemedicine unbelievably important, right? For them. Now, that said, the way to get them there is not to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a TV commercial just bringing more awareness to hyperhidrosis. They know that they have something, right? The way that they sweat and when they sweat and how they sweat, they know something's different. And they're actively looking for a solution or an answer. It's very efficient for us to put that answer in front of them while they're looking, rather than try to get them to think about it when they're not. So it's empathetic on our part to do that. It's efficient for us. The cost per acquisition is much lower, a couple $100 compared to thousands. And they are influenced by what their peers who have the condition say. And all of those things culminate in the perfect storm of reaching those 6.3 million patients, getting them to a telemedicine physician, and getting that product so they don't even have to leave the house to do it. And once they're on it, and the product delivers on its promise, its data, then they have the ability to go out and do what they do when they do. And that's when we know we've made the impact that we set out to do.
Right, thanks. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I've got a couple more questions I want to get to here. Someone's challenged our math here, Howie, just FYI. So apparently you mentioned before that there was 50,000 patients in Lisa's Hyperhidrosis Society database that are already kind of actively looking. So the numbers of 100,000 patients and 6 refills at $500, apparently half of your work is already done, was the comment here. So I won't get you to react to that, but people are listening, which is great. So maybe we do have a number of questions here around obviously the FDA approval, the timing of that FDA approval, and kind of level of confidence around that. So maybe I'll take that question again in terms of our interaction. So yes, the FDA has received our materials. Now they've advised us that it's a complete response, which is excellent. There's been a number of questions backwards and forwards, as there always is, with the FDA and reviewing those data, responding to those questions, clarifying aspects. We have engaged with FDA literally in the last number of weeks, and as a result, have a high level of confidence around that approval at the end of June. So that's obviously what we're working towards, and all the effort that's going in from the team at the moment is focused on being ready when that approval comes through to get ourselves to launch. So in the last couple of minutes, just want to cover up a couple of things. There's a question here, Howie, maybe if you can take this from Andrew, around when will things like the Sofdra.com page actually launch, and what can the investors expect to see publicly about that?
And so, there's a coming soon page out there right now, Sofdra.com. We're able to do that. You can't do anything prior to approval. It'll be in concert with the rollout of product availability in the coming months. Just due to competitive reasons, we don't like to divulge exact dates, but in a phased approach, post approval, we'll have all of those materials and websites ready to go, and we'll certainly share that with our investor community as they are. So I don't want to be avoiding the question there, Matt, but I also know that we like to share as much as possible without giving up any competitive advantage that we have.
Sure. We've just got a clarifying question from one of our shareholders who I do recognise. So I'll say it's T who's asking the question, but the question is in relation to kind of the population, how we think about that target population. So what's in that 3.7 million people versus the 10 million people, if you can just clarify that, Howie, and whether those 3.7 have been diagnosed or they're just people who are looking, if you can just make the difference between those two, please.
So 3.7 million patients are those that visited a physician office during that period of data. And the 6.3 is just the delta between the 10 million that we know have primary axillary hyperhidrosis and those that went to go see a doctor. We don't anticipate those numbers to change greatly from year to year. We'll see. Right? Ultimately, it would be great if most of them went through telemedicine. That the 6.3 went through telemedicine, and even if some of the 3.7 shifted over, that would be fine too. As long as they're going to one of those two places, we're going to be in a position to help them, because we have the 25 sales representatives calling on those 4,500 tops for dermatologists, and then we will be, through our targeted campaign, ensuring that those 6.3 million patients have the opportunity to be diagnosed and have fulfillment within potentially 48 hours.
Right. I want to get to two last questions here. One of them is from an Australian analyst, which maybe John or Howie, you want to take this one, which is in relation to those phase 1 accounts that you've been engaging, just timing of contracting with them. Are you discussing price with them and some of those obstacles specifically, or are they still kind of general conversations? So maybe John, you want to take the first of that?
Sure. So those phase 1 targets, we have completed the clinical presentations to the contracting PBMs. We are going to begin to engage in pricing negotiations with them here in early June. What we're hearing is that as far as executing contracts, they have indicated we can kind of run up to the finish line, but they won't actually execute a contract until after approval. It's just based on previous history with other products that have not been approved. So that's kind of their policy. But I think that shortly after our approval, we will finish executing those agreements.
And I'll just add to that, John and his team have done something that hasn't been done in pharmaceuticals before. And they had pricing discussions with the payers prior to launch. And not just pricing discussions, but how they would view various price points. So versus a pricing study or market research, we're actually having the discussion with the individuals that ultimately provide the contract. So highly innovative there because it hasn't been done. And their team is also able to release price to these payers confidentially, so that they're in the position to sign very quickly.
Thanks, Sally. So we're just kind of running to the end of time here, and I just wanted to leave 30 seconds at the end here just to hand over to our exec chair, Vince, just to close the webinar and thank everyone for their attendance.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. I'd like to thank all the participants on the webcast here today for the preparation in this commercial overview. Thank you for that. But more importantly, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here today. As Matt had mentioned, we've got a record number of people attending this here today, so a high degree of interest in our commercial launch. I hope this has been helpful for you, as a lot of the heavy lifting has gone into what's happened prior to today as we've prepared for commercial readiness. Obviously, with the robust clinical trials and all the work with the FDA that has been done here to provide the great data set that we have for Sofdra. But now it's all about execution. It's all about taking what you've seen here today and taking it out to the field, to physicians and patients with Sofdra. This is when the fun begins. It's a very exciting time here at Botanix, and we wait with great anticipation for our approval from the FDA. Once again, thank you all for joining us here today. We much appreciate the time and attention, and most certainly the thoughtful questions that followed the presentation.
Thanks, Vince. And again, thanks to everyone for attending. Thank you to our panel, and we're going to close the session there. Good night and good morning.
Thank you.